Welcome to the Deep Dive. Tonight, we're going back to 1972, December. Imagine you're on a flight, and you're almost to Miami. Holiday season, you've got presents in the overhead bins, everything's, going pretty smoothly. And then a small problem, a tiny little light for the landing gear malfunctions. And this state-of-the-art aircraft ends up crashing into Florida Everglades. This is Eastern Airlines Flight 401. It's a story of mistakes, of survival, and even some Suki ghost stories.
Even after all these years, what I find really interesting about this crash is how a bunch of little things, none of them that serious on their own, can kind of snowball into a really terrible situation. I think it just goes to show how important the human element is in aviation.
Yeah.
Even experienced crews can make these kinds of mistakes.
Yeah, it's like dominoes, right? One thing leads to another, and suddenly, boom, you've got a disaster on your hands. So, okay, let's rewind back to December 29th, 1972. We've got Eastern Airlines Flight 401 heading from JFK to Miami. On board, you've got, families heading back from the holidays, couples excited for a warm getaway, maybe some folks just happy to be home in Florida.
Right, and they were flying on a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, a brand new plane at the time, really cutting edge. And the crew, they were top-notch. Captain Bob Loft had tons of experience, thousands of flight hours. And First Officer Albert Stockstill, he was no rookie either.
So you're saying, everything should have been fine.
On paper, yeah, absolutely.
But then, as they're getting ready to land, they run into a problem. The indicator light for the nose gear, it's not coming on. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean the landing gear is broken, but it does mean there's uncertainty.
Yeah.
And in aviation, uncertainty can be a really bad thing.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So the crew, naturally, they start trying to figure out what's wrong with the light. But here's the thing. They get so focused on this one problem that they completely lose track of everything else. They don't even realize that while they're messing with the controls, they've accidentally turned off the autopilot.
Hold on. So they're so focused on this one light that they don't realize the plane is going off course and losing altitude.
Exactly. It's a classic case of tunnel vision.
Mm.
When you're under stress, it's easy to get fixated on one thing and ignore everything else. And in a cockpit, that can be disastrous.
Meanwhile, down in the cabin, things are starting to feel a little weird.
Hmm.
One of the flight attendants, Beverly Raposa, who later becomes really important in, remembering the victims, she starts to hear a strange noise coming from the engines. She even mentions it to another flight attendant, but by then it's too late.
Yeah, can you imagine you're just sitting there, not knowing that the plane's about to crash, and then bam, the plane dips, the lights go out, and you're thrown forward.
It's a terrifying thought, and the impact is just devastating. Flight 401 slams into the Florida Everglades, which, is this huge, unforgiving swamp, sawgrass, mud, water, you name it. The plane breaks apart, sending wreckage and passengers everywhere.
It must have been like something out of a nightmare. Pitch black, the smell of jet fuel, people screaming, and alligators lurking in the water. For those who survived the initial impact, the fight was just beginning.
And some of those survivors have amazing stories of, resilience and determination. Like, take Ron Infantino. He was on his honeymoon with his wife, excited for the future. Then the crash takes his wife, and he's trapped in the wreckage, hurt and surrounded by alligators in the dark.
And then there's Mercy Ruiz, who wakes up after the crash and thinks it's all just a bad dream. That feeling of shock and disbelief must have been overwhelming.
It's incredible how people can survive something like that. But in all this chaos, there's also a glimmer of hope. And that comes in the form of Bud Markey, this local frog hunter. He's out in the Everglades with a friend when they see the crash. Without hesitation, he jumps in his airboat, uses his headlamp for light, and races towards the wreckage.
It was an incredibly brave thing to do. He risked his own life to pull people from the wreckage and get them to safety. He was a true hero that night.
It's incredible. But while all this is happening, something else is going on, something a little darker.
Yeah, there were reports of locals looting the crash site, stealing from the bodies of the victims.
It's hard to believe that people would do that in a situation like that.
It's a reminder that even in the face of tragedy, some people will take advantage of others.
Absolutely. As the sun came up, the full scale of the tragedy became clear. Out of 176 people on board, 101 died. It was a terrible loss, and the National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB, was tasked with figuring out what went wrong.
The NTSB investigation was incredibly thorough. They listened to the black boxes, examined the wreckage, and interviewed everyone they could. And what they found was both surprising and incredibly disturbing.
So what happened? Was it something wrong with the plane?
The crazy thing is, the NTSB ruled out any major mechanical problems. The engines were fine, the plane itself was intact, and the weather was clear.
Wait, so you're telling me this brand new plane with a great crew crashed because of a mistake?
It wasn't just one mistake. It was a bunch of little oversights, miscommunications, and bad decisions that all together led to this disaster. And it all started with that faulty landing gear light. So the NTSB, they said that the crew got so fixated on that one light, that faulty indicator, that they basically developed tunnel vision. You know, they were so focused on fixing that one thing that they completely lost track of what was happening to the plane as a whole. They didn't notice they were losing altitude, that the autopilot was off, all those warning signs.
It's kind of scary, isn't it, to think that such a small thing could lead to such a huge disaster.
Yeah.
But I gotta ask, wouldn't a crew with that much experience, wouldn't they have been trained to avoid this kind of, like, mental trap?
You'd think so, right? And that's what makes this crash so interesting, from a psychological point of view. It turns out that even the most experienced pilots can make these kinds of mistakes under pressure. And because of this crash, pilot training changed. They started focusing more on situational awareness and avoiding fixating on just one problem.
So this tragedy actually led to some positive changes in aviation safety. But let's talk more about the people who survived this crash. We've touched on a few of their stories, but I'd love to hear more about what happened to them after. What kind of challenges did they face?
Oh, the impact of the crash was huge, both physically and emotionally. Lots of survivors had really serious injuries, broken bones, burns, cuts from the wreckage. And for those who lost loved ones, the grief was just unbearable.
I can't imagine the kind of trauma they went through.
Yeah.
Did they receive any kind of help, counseling or therapy to deal with all of that?
Well, back in 1972, people didn't really understand PTSD very well. So sadly, a lot of survivors didn't get the support they needed. Many of them struggled with nightmares, flashbacks, anxiety, even decades after the crash.
It's just heartbreaking. But it's also amazing how many of them were able to rebuild their lives and move forward. Now let's talk about something a little different, something that a lot of people find really intriguing about Flight 401, the ghost stories.
Ah, yes, the ghost stories. This is where things get a little spooky. Almost as soon as the crash happened, rumors started spreading among Eastern Airlines employees about strange things happening on other flights, especially those that used parts salvaged from Flight 401.
Hold on, they actually used parts from the crashed plane on other planes.
Yeah, it was pretty common practice back then. Airlines would salvage usable parts from wrecked planes to save money. And in the case of Flight 401, this led to some pretty creepy stories.
Okay, now you got to give me the details.
Well, one of the most famous stories is about a flight attendant who had a premonition about the crash. Weeks before Flight 401 even took off, she was having these vivid nightmares about a plane crashing in the Everglades. She even described things like Christmas decorations scattered in the wreckage, which is pretty eerie considering it was the holiday season.
Wow, that's definitely creepy. But what about actual ghost sightings? People seeing ghosts on the planes.
Oh, there were plenty of those, too. Lots of Eastern Airlines employees, pilots, flight attendants, mechanics. They all reported seeing apparitions of Captain Loft and Second Officer Don Repo on different flights. Some people saw them sitting in passenger seats, others saw them in the galley or even the cockpit. And they would just vanish into thin air.
Wait, so they're seeing the ghosts of the pilots who died in the crash?
That's what a lot of people believed. They said the descriptions matched Loft and Repo perfectly, and sometimes these apparitions would even interact with people like they were trying to communicate.
I bet the airline tried to keep all of this quiet. Can you imagine the PR nightmare if people thought their planes were haunted?
Exactly. Eastern Airlines tried to dismiss these stories, saying it was just rumors, hallucinations, anything but ghosts. But there were just so many reports, and they came from credible people who actually knew Loft and Repo that it was hard to ignore.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Were some of these sightings real? Or is there a more rational explanation? Could it be the trauma of the crash, the grief and guilt, caused people to imagine things?
It's possible. Grief can be a powerful thing, and it can manifest in strange ways. But some of the stories go beyond just seeing an apparition. Like, there are stories of Repo appearing to warn pilots about dangers, like a fire hazard on one flight, which turned out to be real.
Now that's where things get really interesting. It's hard to explain something like that away.
Yeah, it really blurs the line between, grief and actual paranormal activity. And I think that's why people are still so fascinated by the Flight 401 ghost stories. Even if you're skeptical, it's hard to deny the impact these stories had on the people who experienced them.
So we've got this tragic crash caused by human error, incredible stories of survival, and then these spooky ghost stories.
Mm-hmm.
It's a complex story with no easy answers, but it definitely makes you think about how fragile life is, how little we know about the universe, and how strong the human spirit can be.
Absolutely. The crash of Flight 401 is a reminder that even small mistakes can have huge consequences. It shows us how important vigilance and communication are, especially in dangerous situations. But it also makes us think about the possibility of life after death, about the things we don't understand, and about the power of human connection, both in life and maybe even beyond.
It's amazing how this one event, this crash, still has people talking. We've talked about the mistakes, the people who survived, and even the ghost stories. But I'm curious, did the NTSB investigation actually change anything? Like, did it make flying safer?
Oh, yeah, definitely. The Flight 401 crash was a big wake-up call for the aviation industry. It really highlighted the importance of what they call crew resource management, or CRM for short. It's all about improving communication and teamwork in the cockpit, especially when things get stressful.
So it's not just about knowing how to fly the plane, but also about how the pilots work together.
Exactly. The NTSB found that the crew on Flight 401, they weren't communicating effectively. They were so focused on that light that they didn't talk to each other properly, and they lost track of what was happening.
So the changes in training we talked about earlier, like avoiding tunnel vision, that was because of this crash.
Yep, that's right. And those changes have made a real difference in aviation safety. Today, pilots get lots of training in CRM. They learn how to work together as a team, share information clearly, and make sure everyone understands what's going on.
So even though it was a terrible tragedy, it sounds like Flight 401 helped prevent other accidents from happening.
Definitely. The lessons learned from that crash have probably saved a lot of lives over the years.
And it's not just about the technical stuff, you know. I'm really struck by the stories of the people who were there that night. The survivors, the rescuers, everyone who helped. It just shows how strong and resilient people can be.
It really does. And of course, we can't forget the people who didn't make it. They lost their lives in this terrible accident. There's a memorial in Miami Springs that honors their memory. It's a reminder of how precious life is and how important it is to remember those we've lost.
It's a sad story, but it's also inspiring to see how people came together after the crash. They supported each other, comforted each other, and helped each other heal.
Yeah, it shows that even in the darkest of times, there's still good in the world. People come together and help each other.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Eastern Airlines Flight 401, I'm feeling a lot of things.
Mm.
Sadness for the lives lost, admiration for the survivors and rescuers, and a sense of wonder at all the mysteries surrounding this event. It makes you think about how fragile we are, how precious life is, and how amazing the human spirit can be.
It's definitely a story that sticks with you. It makes you question what you know about the world, both the things we can see and the things we can't. And it reminds you that even when faced with the unknown, people still search for meaning, connection, and purpose.
Well, thank you for joining us tonight as we explored the history and mystery of Eastern Airlines Flight 401. It's been a fascinating journey, and we hope you'll join us again for more captivating stories from the past. Until next time, keep exploring and stay curious.